Hello, it's Nigel, and welcome back to the Crew of Japan podcast. This episode is part 2 of our discussion with Dr. Hiromu Nagahara. In this episode, Dr. Nagahara teaches us of the role of the shogun throughout Japanese history.
Eventually, it became clear and established that the warrior government was the most powerful political authority in Japan. In fact, even a retired emperor attempted to overthrow the Kamakura shogunate and was soundly defeated.
The Japanese Imperial Family throughout World War II.
And this recent revelation sort of describes him as both being, on one sense, hesitant and worried about getting into war with America, but also switching and transitioning at some point in November of 1940 or so to a kind of more enthusiastic posture towards the war.
And some recent events going on within the Japanese family.
Can Princess Mako make a claim to that article and marry who she wants to? Her father, Prince Akishino, or the now Crown Prince Akishino, explicitly referenced Article 24, saying that's what the Constitution says, so at the end of the day, I'm going to allow my daughter to marry who she wants.
Welcome back to the Crew of Japan podcast, a weekly podcast where we take you on audio journeys through Japanese culture. Be sure to check out part 1 if you haven't already, and let's dive right on in.
You had mentioned earlier things started to shift a little bit once the rise of the samurai started to happen, and specifically what we were going to talk about a little bit is the relationship between the emperor and those vying for power during the Sengoku period, like the Warring States period. You know, what was that power dynamic, and how did how did the relationship coexist compared to the previous one, where you said like the aristocrats and the emperor kind of worked in tandem almost, or the imperial house and the aristocrats worked in tandem. How was that power dynamic when so many other people were vying for power in Japan? You know, was there a side that the emperor took, or was it more so you guys duke it out and I'll just stick with the winner? You know, like what was the how did that play out?
Yeah, so there's an important transition period between the Sengoku era and the period where the governance of the state was firmly rooted in Kyoto, right, in the Heian period, which is the first and second shogunate, the Kamakura shogunate and the Ashikaga shogunate. So, Kamakura shogunate emerges towards the end of the 12th century. And is so called because the shogunate, the government of the military, right? The government centered by the samurai, in this case the Minamoto clan, was set in Kamakura. But the Kamakura shogunate for a while governed only their direct vassals, right? Samurai vassals who were kind of centered mostly in the east of the country. But during the 13th century, they shifted towards, taking control over more and more parts of the country, including the western parts of Japan, which had traditionally been more under the control of the court, even under the Kamakura shogunate. But eventually, it became clear and established that the warrior government was the most powerful political authority in Japan. In fact, even a retired emperor attempted to overthrow or fight the Kamakura shogunate, and was soundly defeated. And Emperor, I believe actually it might have been the same emperor who loved Chrysanthemum, the Emperor Gotoba, who raised up an army and was soundly defeated. And that was a signal that, oh wow, the power of the center of the political gravity in the country was shifting eastward and towards the samurai class. But even then, there was still a kind of lands that aristocracy and the court controlled and taxed and so forth. The Kamakura shogunate actually ended when another retired emperor, Emperor Godaigo, called on sort of discontented samurai vassals of Kamakura to overthrow and place him, in a firm control of the country. And so he got the help of a man named Ashikaga Takauji, among others, overthrew the Kamakura shogunate and tried to govern the country himself. in a model of a Chinese emperor. He only lasted a few years. Ended up fighting Ashikaga Takauji, who overthrew him and established the Ashikaga shogunate, right? Which was now established in Kyoto. And again, that firmly established basically a government of the country by the samurai. Um, and so gradually during the Ashikaga period, the emperor and the imperial court more broadly shifted from politics and more towards culture, right? As guardians and upholders of traditional culture. Um, but throughout this period, whether it's in the Kamakura, Ashikaga, or for that matter, later periods like Sengoku, the emperor remained the symbolic source of political legitimacy, right? The emperor was the one who appointed uh, the samurai leaders to the position of the shogun, right, the barbarian subduing generalissimo, which was a court title, right, or court position. And so uh, on a kind of high level symbolic level, the emperor remained a kind of source of legitimacy. And so when it comes towards the end of the Sengoku period, where you have people like Toyotomi Hideyoshi or Tokugawa Ieyasu vying for power, um, they're no longer fighting against the court because the court is powerless. And in fact, by the time you get to this Sengoku period, the imperial court is oftentimes described as being impoverished, right? Financially sort of unstable and needing the support of leading daimyo or warlords. Um, uh, you know, whatever the case with their economy, people like Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Ieyasu go back to the court to receive titles. Hideyoshi solidified his hold on power over most of Japan by being given the title of imperial regent. He, in fact, I believe, had an aristocratic family officially adopt him as an heir. And so he actually attempted to solidify his power by joining, in some sense, symbolically, the court, and by taking on that traditionally Fujiwara court title or court position of an imperial regent, Kampaku. Ieyasu, though, took a different tack, right? He actually tried to solidified his power by receiving from the court the title of Sei Taishogun, the barbarian subduing generalissimo or shogun, um, and which was from the time of the Kamakura shogunate, the title that was given to the most powerful figure amongst the samurai class. And so even when the imperial court didn't really have political power, they in some sense remained a kind of source of an important enough source of symbolic political legitimacy that all of these warring samurai figures ultimately went to the court to receive that recognition, that imprimatur, and apparently never thought of overthrowing them, right? Never thought of setting up their own imperial dynasty, as it were.
So when I hear that, I think, well, perhaps it's because they bought into the ancient myths of the origin story of descending from Amaterasu. Would it have been the case that people like Ieyasu or Hideyoshi would they have been familiar with things like, and I'm not sure if it was necessarily written in, but the Kojiki, and things that were putting down to words the ancient origin stories of the imperial family.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm a little bit dubious as to sort of how familiar the vast majority of warriors would have been with some of these writings. I mean, some
Mhm.
of them weren't literate, so or
Right,
many of them
right.
weren't literate. So
I would imagine, yeah.
I think maybe there was a broad, to some extent there was that kind of broadly accepted uh uh belief in those ancient myths or some derivatives thereof. But I think maybe a more immediate and probably politically structural reasons why they kept on going back to the imperial household is that it was this durable institution that had survived these different shogunates, and had always served as a kind of prestige conferring institutions, right? And also, to some degree, especially early on, being one of the connecting points between Japan and the outside world. The imperial, the imperial family, or the imperial court itself, right? Uh, Emerged as a royal institution in the Heian period, or in the periods before the Heian period, uh, primarily through its connections with China, right? By sort of modeling itself on a Chinese imperial dynasty, by adopting some aspects of Chinese government systems and bureaucracy, and most last but not least, the various cultural trappings, right, from Chinese culture. And so uh, there's a way in which I think cosmopolitanism is itself conferred a kind of legitimacy and prestige in the eyes of other Japanese. And I think these warriors. I mean, you see that, I think, especially in the case of Hideyoshi, who literally came up from nowhere, um, and followed various powerful warlords, ultimately Oda Nobunaga, but was ultimately extremely conscientious of his own lowly birth, and was very eager to put on the trappings of the Kyoto aristocracy, right? By ultimately getting himself adopted into an aristocratic family, and thereby uh, uh, becoming, gaining access to all the sort of cultural capital that had accrued over centuries and centuries, right?
Yeah, that's fascinating. So the legitimacy aspect, perhaps more so than the belief
Yeah.
in the ancient origins of mythology. That makes sense. It makes total sense. So we have this system where an emperor is in place and the shogun comes in, and that persists. With events going on for centuries. Japan somewhat closes its borders to the rest of the world for periods of time, opens and closes, and that leads us to the 1800s, where Emperor Meiji and the Meiji Restoration happens. And during this period, how did Emperor Meiji's influence help transform Japan into something that looks more similar to the European and Western powers at large?
Yeah, I think Meiji Emperor, um, it might be sort of perhaps more accurately framed as, what was Meiji Emperor's role in it, or how was he used in that transformation? Because
Mhm.
I'm not sure to what degree Meiji Emperor Mutsuhito, the person, led this change, right? He was actually a 14-year-old who came
Ah,
when he
okay.
came to the throne, right before the Meiji Restoration of 1868, who was largely molded by the key leading figures of that political change, and transformed from a pre-modern monarch into a modern European style monarch, right? I mean, his appearance, I'm sure you've seen, various photographs of him, literally is transformed, right? From his ancient court attire that he wears at the time of his enthronement, to a modern European military uniform. And so, both Emperor Meiji, and for that matter, his father and grandfather, the two previous emperors, um, I think the function that they served was largely as inspirations, right? That were useful, or maybe put differently, their function was to serve as useful symbols for the changes that people wanted to make. And so, you know, Emperor Meiji's grandfather, Emperor Kome, and his grandfather, whose name I'm blanking on, um, became those two emperors became a kind of center of, uh, you know, reverence and political activism of group of samurai who were increasingly discontented with the Tokugawa shogunate, right? And especially once Western powers began to encroach on Japanese borders, the emperor then became identified with a movement towards defending Japan and expelling the barbarians, right? And so you end up with a political slogan of Son no Joi, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, that begin to emerge in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Um, and and so Emperor Meiji, in some sense, is a capstone figure of that, right? He is ultimately used by especially samurai from the Satsuma and Choshu domain, who in his name declare that they are going to restore the rightful powers to the emperor to govern the country, and therefore we are also going to not only take the shogunate away from the Tokugawas, but expropriate their land. Um, but after that initial change, I think the Emperor Meiji then serves a different kind of symbolic role, right? Which is as a center of loyalty, not just for discontented anti-Tokugawa samurai, but for the newly molded Japanese citizens, right? The Japanese citizens as citizens and subjects of a modern nation state. And so in that role, the Emperor Meiji, is I think molded into a modern monarch who sets, an example for the rest of the country of what it means to be a modern civilized individual. In fact, his wife, Empress Shoken, also is asked to serve a similar kind of role, and she also goes through a similar visual shift from an ancient court dress into the latest European, Parisian style dress, right? And so both of them are used as a kind of an example of promoting the kinds of changes that the Meiji state wanted to effect socially, culturally, politically. um, but speaking of politics, maybe the most important thing, at least for the people who were establishing the post-restoration state in Meiji Japan, was that the emperor did continue to serve as the legitimizer, right, of the kinds of actions that the state wanted to take. And I think he was an especially important figure for some of the unelected members of the Japanese state. Oftentimes called the oligarchy. Some of the leaders of the Meiji Restoration who continue to shape, the Japanese government. Including people like Ito Hirobumi, the first prime minister, Yamagata Aritomo, who is oftentimes identified as one of the founders of the Japanese army or Japanese military. For these kind of figures, the emperor remained a kind of, justification, right, for their various political programs, including industrialization.
And so did that role continue after Meiji, with the early 1900s and leading up to you know Japan's involvement in World War II? Was the emperor still kind of in that legitimizer role for justification for some of the actions that Japan had been taking in terms of the events leading up to World War II?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think, the Meiji Constitution, that I've mentioned a couple times, is, the first chapter is on the emperor, right? And gives him the sovereignty, and basically says that he is the foundation on which this nation is built, and he is the foundation on which the state acts. And so absolutely, even the subsequent emperors, Emperor Taisho and Emperor Showa, or also known as Hirohito, uh, were used as the sort of source of authority and legitimacy for even the wartime regime. That's not to say, though, that they were completely passive figures. So Meiji Emperor was known as a kind of uh, fairly robust figure who loved to drink and apparently loved to torment some of his servants by throwing asparagus down to the ground or something. There's some episodes that I've been learning about, the quirky lives of some of the emperors, that you don't necessarily read about everywhere. But more importantly, I think Meiji Emperor, was also a very larger than life figure who became identified with and with an entire generation, right, of Japanese who had lived through the massive transitions of the Meiji era. And so when he died in 1912, you know, there is a palpable sense of loss that a lot of the people writing in that period expressed. You know, most famously, Natsume Soseki in the book Kokoro, describes that sense of loss, right? Um, and so Emperor Meiji kind of served that symbolic role, but it was also known at times to sort of intervene on the background politically, and the similar combination of kind of a symbolic role and a kind of intervening role could be said of Emperor Hirohito, the Showa emperor as well. So, on the one hand, in the lead up to war, even during the war, in fact, most recently, there was another batch of diaries that some of one of his attendants had written that was publicized in Japan, like even in the last week, that records sort of how the emperor reacted to sort of the lead. I think in this case, it was in the lead up to the attack on Pearl Harbor, and this recent revelation sort of describes him as both being, on one sense, hesitant and worried about getting into war with America, but also switching and transitioning at some point in November of 1940 or so to a kind of more enthusiastic posture towards the war. And so, Emperor Hirohito has been especially controversial in that area, right? Of to what degree was he involved in Japan's decision to sort of get into that disastrous war? To what degree did he support it? To what degree was he a puppet? Um, and I think the truth is somewhere between a puppet and a hands-on monarch, right? He wasn't completely hands-off. He did intervene at several key moments in the history of Showa era. But like Emperor Meiji, who had a fairly long reign, I think something like 40 years, Emperor Showa had an even longer reign, right? His reign starts in 1926, and he doesn't die until 1989. Um, and so when he had passed away, there was also a palpable sense that an era had really ended, right? An era that the first half of which was identified with a tragic war, and the second half of which was identified with Japan's transformation into the second largest economy in the world. And so when he passes, most um dramatically described in Norma Field's book, In the Realm of a Dying Emperor. It's one of the classics, right, in Japan studies. She describes a kind of the ways in which national atmosphere had dramatically shifted during those years, right, and during the last year or two of the emperor's death, and I think that sense of wow, something momentous had shifted, I think was shared broadly among the people.
Yeah, and that kind of takes me to my next question, which was going to be on the transition to the the constitutional monarchy slash parliamentary system. But we kind of touched on that earlier of kind of how the emperor today is not necessarily the head of state, but occupies this. Would it be fair to say a gray zone?
Yeah, yes, absolutely.
Okay.
He gets treated as the head of state, right, when he goes overseas, and he functions oftentimes in that way.
Right.
He opens the diets, he formally appoints the prime minister and cabinet ministers, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. So and I'm glad you just mentioned the diet. So the diet, to my understanding, actually existed before the current post-war constitution. It came about during the Meiji era constitution as the imperial diet. And I guess for listeners, you might be wondering what is a diet? Where did that come from? Because we refer to it as Congress. In other countries, they refer to it as Parliament.
It's something you start on January 1st and end on January 10th or something like that, right?
Exactly. Other people know it as
Sorry.
that.
Cheap
So
jokes. That's what we're here for.
the diet. I mean, do you have an explanation of that's better than I guess something that we could come up with of what the diet is.
Why that term came to be used?
Sure, yeah, of the term and also I guess what it actually how it functions, I guess. Post-war, the diet I imagine looked pretty different from the pre-war diet.
Yeah.
And what sort of changes happened there?
Absolutely. So, as far as I know, the diet is an English or, European term, right? I think the only time that I've seen this referenced in history is the Diet of Worms, which comes up in Protestant Reformation history. It's, diet was the way in which the convocation in the Holy Roman Empire was oftentimes described. So it might also be a Germanic term or, related to German history. But it's another European term that's equivalent to parliament. And what emerged under the Meiji Constitution, right, was a bicameral legislature with that in many ways resembled a combination of the British and the Prussian legislature at that time. And so you had the House of Peers, which was equivalent to the House of Lords, and you have the House of Representatives, which was largely elected by citizens. Of course, when the Meiji Constitution, when the first diet opened in 1890 in Meiji era, the electorate was something like 1% of the population. Because there was a heavy limitation, like in many other actually uh, uh, parliamentary, even in America, right? I think very early on, there was a lot of property limitation and so forth. Um, that gradually expanded even in the pre-World War II era, uh, to a point where by 1918, you have the party that has the majority in the House of Representatives, effectively having the power to select a prime minister, who chooses his cabinets, who are mostly made up of members of his political party, the Seiyukai, in the Diet. And in fact, it's a kind of a timely theme because we just had the 100th anniversary of the assassination of Hara Kei or Hara Takashi, who was the prime minister who is oftentimes described as leading Japan's first, uh, in a real way, party-led cabinet.
Oh,
And
wow.
so, even under the Meiji Constitution, Japan had for some time a kind of system where we're familiar with, right? Where the majority party in in the lower house of the legislature actually has the power to form the government and to some degree control it. Um, uh, what I think is different between sort of that kind of diet and what emerged in the post-war is that those developments were sort of given a much more firm constitutional footing. So the Meiji Constitution, for example, does not mention political parties or, for that matter, prime minister. Um, right? And so there's a kind of vagueness to those political institutions that emerged, in a kind of de facto format. And so uh, it's in many ways it's the same diet. It meets in the same diet building. It still has two houses, and as was the case in the pre World War II, uh, you know, diet from 1918 until about 19 early 1930s, the majority party in the lower house selects the prime minister. Um, it's just that there were so many caveats and exceptions in the pre-World War II Constitution that, right, what we know of is a story of a kind of attempts at democracy and certain practices of it that ultimately gets undermined in an era where the military becomes increasingly adventurous, both in overseas and domestically, and begins to interfere, and you ultimately get to 1945. um, but under the post-war constitution, the diet is described as the highest governing organ of the state, and the diet clearly identifies the prime minister, the cabinet, right, and having basis on a majority in the lower house of the Diet. And so you get a system where uh, the kinds of attempts and efforts at democratic practice that actually had emerged in the first half of the 20th century is now given a formal constitutional guarantee.
And with no mention of the emperor, since he's not the head of state.
So ironically, the emperor is still the very first chapter of the post-war constitution. So the emperor is still very much in the picture, right? And I believe it's the first article of chapter 1 that describes the emperor as a symbol of the symbol of national unity. And so in fact, there is actually, even structurally, even though the post-war constitution is oftentimes described as MacArthur constitution, because it was created under sort of heavy guidance of the occupation authorities, nonetheless, right, what ultimately emerges have some interesting continuities, right, even if it has important uh, departures. And so the emperor is still there. Now the emperor no longer has the sovereignty. The emperor is no longer the commander in chief of the military like he was under the previous constitution, and the emperor is no longer. I think the post-war constitution explicitly says that the emperor uh, does not wield political power. He does serve certain functions of state. So he opens and closes the parliament. He appoints the prime minister and cabinet members. But all of these are done under the guidance and approval of the cabinet. And so, uh, there's a, but it's not that he's not there. It's just that he's heavily limited. And they no longer have private property. That's also explicitly stated in the Constitution.
So back in our season 1, we had actually a really fantastic interview with another historian, Tomoko Kitagawa, who was pretty well known for a book that she wrote in Japan called Lady Samurai. And she had done a lecture series at Harvard for a few years when she taught there. I believe I don't know if she's still at Oxford now, but she was teaching at Oxford for a bit. And then now is doing something more with like the history of science and math at the Science Museum in London. But when we spoke with her, we had a really great conversation about the Lady Samurai and the women that played pivotal roles during the Sengoku period. So we wanted to just touch on briefly the role of women within the imperial house and how did that role evolve over time. I know you mentioned earlier it was an early empress, correct? I can't remember her name.
Empress Jito.
Jito, yeah. So was she at what point in the line, I guess chronologically, what empress, like pretty early on? Which time period was
late
that?
7th century.
7th century.
Yeah.
Okay. Since Jito, has there been any other empresses in Japan?
Yeah, so there's been several empresses, and in fact, the oldest one is, I think, even before Jito. I think the first monarch is a monarch named Suiko in the late 6th century, and she's known as, I believe, leading the creation of some of the earliest chronicles of Japan, these imperial chronicles. Um, there was another powerful empress in the 7th century named Empress Koken, and also Shotoku, because she ascended to the throne twice. I think by the second time by deposing her nephew, and so she was a very powerful, feisty figure. And then after that, we don't really see a hugely powerful empress, mainly because the power shifts from the court in Kyoto to other centers of power, whether it's Kamakura or wherever else. But you do, as late as the late 18th century, the 1700s. The very last empress then was an empress named Go Sakuramachi. You do have women monarchs coming up to the throne from time to time. And so, I think as far as empresses go, or actual reigning monarchs go, I think the earlier ones are clearly the more powerful ones, because the earlier monarchs were more generally the more powerful figures. But I think throughout history, throughout all these centuries, there were other women, right, in the imperial court who were also, in many ways, as important, or in some sense even more important. And so, we talked about Fujiwara no Michinaga being connected to the imperial line through women, right? Through his daughters and granddaughters and great granddaughters, who were the key connecting points, right, between these imperial families, aristocratic families, and the imperial line. These connections simply wouldn't have happened without these women. Um, and then you also, get this social and cultural community surrounding these imperial consorts, whether they're Fujiwara or not. And so I think, Doug, you mentioned reading Murasaki Shikibu, right? But Murasaki Shikibu, or for that matter, another woman named Seisho Nagon, were both attendants to one of those Fujiwara consorts, who were essentially court ladies, right? And so they were, and they, not only served the court, but we know of them primarily as the producers and icons of some of the heights of classical Japanese culture, right? And I think, and so, these women continue to play that role of connecting families, of engaging, preserving, upholding sort of several different important cultural pursuits. Some of those families, many of those families, ancient Kyoto court families, still exist to this day, and nowadays that is their raison d'être, right? Their kind of the reason why they continue to exist. The families that even today, uphold certain lines of various ways, right? Various doles, whether it's sado or kado, or tea, flower, incense. There are various sort of these ancient cultural pursuits that are still upholded by these aristocratic families, whose women, right, oftentimes play a very important role. Later on, even in an era when the warriors are calling shots, as it were, marriage with the imperial family still remained important. And so Tokugawa shoguns, right, actually, both at the beginning of their rule in the 1600s and towards the end, as the Tokugawas were losing their grip on power, conducted marriage, right, with the imperial court, in order to shore up their political authority. And so that kind of role by women, was played fairly recently as well. And in fact, if you think about in terms of shoring up political power and support, um, in the 20th century, right? Figures like Empress Michiko and the current Empress Masako have also been crucial in sort of encouraging a kind of popularity of the masses, right? Of the allure of commoner marriage and the fanfare surrounding it and so forth. And so I think women in the imperial household continue to serve a really important role. And of course, nowadays the controversy is over. Well, are they being treated with due, respect, or are they treated well enough, right? Why are they forced to become commoners when they marry? Is that something you should be doing when there are already so few members of the imperial household? um then some people say, well, but actually it's a really confined existence. Should we ask any human to exist in a way that we ask the members of the imperial household to do? So I'm kind of getting off to the sideline, but all that to say, I think women have served really important roles, in the past, and continue to do so now in the imperial household.
No, and honestly, that's like one of our follow up questions, down the line anyway. So we can touch on it now since we're on the topic.
Yeah.
But you know, the line of succession being is kind of a hot topic, hot button topic for just media and just people in Japan and around the world. Just curious, once Naruhito's current emperor's time comes to an end as emperor when he decides either to step down or whatever it may be, who's coming next? Who would be next in line? And I mean, in the past, it seems that there were women at the top of the food chain in terms of being the empress, that figure, and whether or not that's acceptable or whatever the right word may be. But it seems like historically there have been women, so
Mhm.
why there is a precedent.
Yeah.
But it's just modern society accepting that image, and that's the controversy. If there is no male heir to the throne, male child for to take over. Um, so who do you think, with the current conversation that's been taking place, uh, who do you think would end up on the throne?
So yeah, that I mean that's determined by law, right? And
Right.
so in the Meiji era, they changed the law and precluded female heirs, female children of the reigning emperor to be in line to the throne.
Okay.
Um, and so currently, the next person in line to the throne is the emperor's younger brother, Prince Akishino, the father of the recently former Princess Mako. And then the next person in line to the throne is Emperor Crown Prince. So Prince Akishino is now actually Crown Prince, or in English. In Japanese, they call him not Kotaishi but Koshi. Um, because I guess he's not the current emperor's child. Um, but after Crown Prince Akishino, it's his son, the youngest. So Prince Akishino has, three kids, two older daughters and a son, who is the youngest of the three, and he would be in line to uh, the throne. And before he was born, there was a big question, right, about, well, should we allow, for example, to change the law so that Princess Aiko, the daughter of the current emperor, to ascend to the throne. But that conversation in the government petered out the moment that son of Crown Prince Akishino was born. And so but it's an ongoing, right, but that doesn't mean that the ultimate succession problem has gone away, because
Right.
the sheer number of the members of the imperial household is shrinking, and so now they're talking about, well, shall we allow the women members of the imperial household who would have been forced to renounce their imperial status upon marriage to retain that status, to preserve air. But that doesn't actually necessarily solve the problem, because my understanding of the current law is that what they want is not just um, uh, male heirs, but the male line is important.
Right.
And so, th- you know, I'm not sure
Yeah.
what they're going to do with that.
Yeah. It's definitely I guess, like you said, the government was trying to work on laws or potentially make an amendment to the Constitution or whatever it may be, but then once a male heir appeared or came to be, they said, "Oh, never mind, we're good."
Yeah,
Uh, so
yeah.
it's just it's kind of wild
Yeah.
that there's wild but not wild.
Yeah,
Um,
and understandably, people have sort of seen sexism in this, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Especially in the kind of requirement of women to lose status upon marriage to commoners. Um, but at the same time, another angle that's worth thinking about is can we ask, or should we be asking, uh, you know, uh, under the current constitution, that for the rest of the Japanese guarantees all kinds of human rights. Can we ask the people, in the imperial family, to continue to exist in a kind of confined state, where in reality their rights uh, are actually confined in ways that we wouldn't even think of, right, for civilians. And so
yeah,
marriage is a great example. The current constitution guarantees marriage, freedom of marriage between a couple, and it explicitly says something about regardless of family interests and so forth. And this is something that a young American woman, Beate Sirota Gordon, who was involved in the writing of that passage, right, during the occupation era. A really fascinating lady. She's very proud of that, right? That I think it's the Article 24 of the Constitution, because she saw it as a way of guaranteeing women's rights in modern Japan. But the debate, right, has been, well, can Princess Mako make a claim to that article and marry who she wants to? Her father, Prince Akishino, or the now Crown Prince Akishino, explicitly referenced Article 24, saying that's what the Constitution says. So at the end of the day, I'm going to allow my daughter to marry who she wants. But some of the more conservative critics of this whole marriage have said, yeah, but the imperial household doesn't count. They can't make the same claim like the rest of us can to do anything they want. And so, I think that creates a kind of, combine that with what I mentioned earlier about private property, right? It is a very anomalous institution, in terms of constitutional rights and so forth. And once we start thinking about, well, what kind what do we think about the human rights of these individual members of the imperial family, the question becomes really, really tricky really quickly, I think.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. Well, with that, we don't want to take up too much more of your time. So if our listeners have stuck around for this, episode, and they're to this point and they want to dig into, more history behind Japan's emperors and empresses, who would be your top 3 emperors or empresses to look into?
Top 3 to look into.
I'm sure that's a loaded question. It's very hard to answer. So maybe you can extend it, or
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Because actually, some the most famous ones, right? The modern ones have been identified with eras, and so they've people have written books about them. Herbert Bix, a prominent historian in Japanese history, has written, I think, a Pulitzer Prize winning book on Hirohito, literally by that title. So that's a book worth reading, if you wanted to look into sort of Hirohito and the complexities of his roles. A more recent book is by a historian named Kenneth Ruoff, professor at Portland State University, and he wrote a book called Japan's Imperial House in the Post-War Era. And it was published last year. So he takes it all the way through the abdication of the Heisei emperor. And so for someone who wants to learn about the more recent history, the post-war history of the imperial household, that's a great book. Another book that I would recommend is by an anthropologist named Takie Sugiyama Libra, called Above the Clouds: Status and Culture of the Modern Japanese Nobility. And so this is actually an ethnography, where Professor Libra went, in the late, I think in the 1970s, 80s, hung out with these people who used to be part of the formal aristocracy until the post-war reforms. And because these people still exist, they are still connected by marriage and personal relationship to the imperial family. And so even though they're not the formal members of the aristocracy, they still exist as a kind of social group, and it's a fascinating ethnography into that. My last recommendation, if you want to look at the kind of the earlier transition of the emperor into a modern monarch, would be by another great historian, Takashi Fujitani, a book called Splendid Monarchy: Power and Pageantry in Modern Japan. That's another, talks about how Emperor Meiji is transformed from a kind of pre-modern into a modern monarch. So I would recommend any of those books.
I think you just severely hurt my wallet as well. So thanks for that.
Sorry.
I have new books to put on the pile of books I really, really want to read, but I don't know if I have the time to do it.
Me too. I have those piles too.
Yeah.
Our decorative bookshelves, right? But one day we'll get to them.
Before we end it, I was going to give you a second if you want to pitch like where people can find you on Twitter if they're interested in following you on Twitter. I know me personally, I kind of run our Twitter page and I follow you. That's how I found you. Like we found you have some really great Twitter threads that you have posted, some great topics that you discuss and
Rants.
everything. But it's a fantastic follow. So if you want to share that or anything
Sure.
about your book,
Yeah.
or anything else you want to know, let people know.
Yeah, people can find me at Hiromu Nagahara, HIROMU NAGAHARA. And also the book that I wrote a few years ago is Tokyo Boogie Woogie, Japan's Pop Era and Its Discontents, out of Harvard University Press. So I hope people read it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. That's fantastic conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. This is it. I was really looking forward to it. This is a topic I really wanted to touch on for a long time, and you took it to the next level. So I'm so happy we were able to get you on for the podcast and discuss this, and maybe in the future for future episodes, if we have historical topics, if you're interested in coming back, we'd love to have you.
Yes, absolutely.
I'd love to do so. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah.
And that's a wrap for this week's episode. We'd like to extend a huge thank you to Dr. Hiromu Nagahara for joining us across these 2 episodes and teaching us all about the Japanese Imperial Family. If you're interested in learning more from Dr. Nagahara, well, I guess you could enroll in MIT, or you could pick up his book, Tokyo Boogie Woogie, Japan's Pop Era and Its Discontents. I know that Doug and I certainly learned a lot, and we hope that you did as well. If you enjoyed the episode, let us know on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Krewe of Japan. That's KREWEOFJAPAN. If you also have some time, leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.